Good morning and welcome to the latest JRP webinar. And this morning's topic will be all about climate change. What will it cost your organization and what can you do about it? Before we go into the slides and introductions into my fellow panelists, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask them using the Q&A button down below, and towards the end obviously of the webinar we'll answer as many of those questions as we can. Those that we don't manage to answer, we'll get back to you shortly after the presentation in the next day or two. There will be a recording of the webinar made available as well. Okay, first slide please. Okay, so I'm joined today by my colleague Eleanor Kershaw, who's a principal net zero and ESG consultant here at JRP, and also by Rob Sunderland from Redlines, who is a climate resilience leader. I'm going to be first of all doing a little bit of background and then handing over to Eleanor to talk about defining climate impact, risk and response, before handing back to myself to talk about climate risk mitigation. And then Rob will talk about how you identify the value at risk. That's putting a pound or dollar sign or euro sign, which really does get the attention of the boardroom, particularly the CFO. And then back to Eleanor to talk about how you build resilience. Next slide, please. So for a little bit of background, who are JRP? For those of you who don't know us, we're currently celebrating our 25th anniversary. We are regarded as being the UK's leading independent energy, net zero and outsourcing specialist. And I'd like to think we are uniquely practical and pragmatic, having worked across all sectors from higher education and healthcare to manufacturing and commercial offices as well. We're supplier and technology agnostic, which puts us in a great position to be able to truly act in our clients' best interests. And having worked across all those sectors, there's a lot of cross-fertilization of ideas and learnings that can be brought to the table. We've been engaged by over 50 clients in the last few years to help them with their own net zero journeys, helping to develop net zero strategies and appropriate shorter-term action plans, and help them to implement some of those, or at least elements of those action plans, from life cycle cost analysis, training, practical technical projects, etc. We don't just talk about it though, we do walk it as well. JRP are proud to be a B Corp certified organisation, have been for a number of years now, and we will be net zero by 2030. You can see samples there of some of the clients that we work with, some of whom we've worked with for many, many years now, and proudly so. Next slide, please. So we operate across 6 core service lines, as you can see there. The first one is part of the subject of today, net zero and climate resilience. Energy is always at our core. That's where we started out. And we do everything to do with energy except the supply of energy itself or plant and equipment. But key to everything, one of the founding stones for any work is data. And for those of you that participate in ESOS, for instance, this is the 3rd phase of ESOS we've just completed, phase 3, and data is still being problematic and challenging for many of those participating organisations. But data is absolutely critical to all work that we do, whether it's net zero, ESG or energy itself. We also get involved in asset management, so that's advising clients around technological solutions such as CHP, or it could be ground horse heat pumps, things of that sort, and supporting agreements that go with that, or indeed complete outsourcing of facilities management, or even insourcing in some cases. Project implementation, we help clients, as I say, we're technology agnostic and supplier agnostic. So again, we can give best advice to clients to find the right technical solution for their required deliverables. And of course, ESG, which goes way beyond. ESG is another name for sustainability, and covers everything beyond net zero and carbon. Next slide, please. I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Eleanor.
Thanks, George. So I'm going to start just by defining some terms so that we're all on the same page. If you pop on to the next slide. So the term double materiality, it's been around for a while. Anyone who's familiar with TCFD particularly will certainly have come across it. But in essence, it means looking both at what are the meaningful and significant impacts that your business has, and then conversely, what the impacts are upon your business. It can be used to apply to any area of impact, but is most commonly used in the context of climate and nature-related impact assessments and disclosures. In practice, this means looking outward from your business at all the ways that your operations and your value chain impact the wider world, and in this case, thinking about greenhouse gas emissions. So this includes all your energy consumption, your on-site physical processes, how your site's managed, particularly agricultural or large estates, your material supply chain, what your third-party service providers are doing for you, such as transport and waste, the products that you provide to your customers, both in use and at the end of life, how your business's money is invested, if you've got any pots of investment, and then your partnerships and your collaborations relating to climate impact, such as through trade bodies or partnerships with key suppliers. But then you also need to look inwards at how current and projected climate change is impacting your business. So that might include physical impacts of extreme weather on your sites, your logistics or your supply chain. What are the trends in temperature and rainfall? How might those affect you? Changes to how your third-party provided services are going to be provided in future. Any increased costs for changing upstream cost and risk factors, such as insurance or procurement. Regulatory changes relating to climate disclosures or levies, particularly on high-emitting industries. And then the changes to your customer needs and priorities, or to the entire market that you operate in potentially. So this is what we're going to be looking at today in a bit more detail. Next slide, please. So there are several terms that are used in discussing climate response and resilience. So I'll briefly sort of define those so we've got a shared understanding for the rest of the webinar. So first of all, mitigation. And then what we mean by that is the UN definition of all actions intended to either reduce emissions or prevent the impact of greenhouse gas emissions from human activities. This broadly falls into two categories, depending on whether you have direct control or indirect influence. So in control, active approaches to operations that reduce the emissions most directly under your control, such as your energy use, your sourcing, your industrial processes, and your land management. And then value chain engagement to reduce emissions associated with the upstream and downstream activities of others, but where your business has influence. And George is going to talk in a lot more detail on this in the next section. Next slide, please. Next, we have climate change adaptation. I don't think anyone can have failed to have noticed that there have been higher instances of extreme weather, flooding, wildfires, and things in recent years, or that seasonal weather has become generally less predictable. But all the global climate change models agree that these cannot be explained without an increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions, which is measurably true, and that this level of greenhouse gases cannot be explained without the impact of human activities. And this is what's meant by the term anthropogenic climate change. But simply, we are already in it. 1.5 degrees of warming has essentially already happened, and meeting the Paris Climate Agreement of net zero by 2050 gives us a chance at stabilising around the level we currently are, but with further long-term impacts that we're not sure about, and times of additional turbulence before a new normal is established. So for your business, climate adaptation is about considering the impacts that are already happening and are likely to happen in future, and what you need to do to be able to continue with stability and profitability as a business. So this will include both your physical operations and your local context, as well as your wider supply chain in terms of short-term adaptation, and then how you approach future projects and business development to reduce the associated risk. Next slide, please. Climate resilience means going beyond that purely physical and reactive approach and thinking about how you will impact and be impacted by the global response to climate change. So how are the mitigation and adaptation approaches of other businesses, of nations and global attitudes going to influence your business? So this could include considering your business in the context of a low carbon future. Where is it going to fit? What are the future costs of mandatory mitigation or disclosure frameworks, such as carbon levies and reports? How are your customers' expectations changing? What will they want from you in terms of products and services? And how will they expect you to evidence that you are part of a climate aware transition? And how all these factors will impact your supply chain, in addition to any physical mitigation adaptation that they need to do to maintain their profitability and sustainability. And where there is a sense of uncertainty, as there is, it's always tempting to take a wait and see approach. But we also need to start quantifying the cost of inaction in order to make an informed choice between doing what we can now and waiting for a potential better solution in future. So that's what we mean by resilience and those three key terms. I'm going to hand over to George now to go into more detail on climate mitigation.
Thank you, Elena. Next slide, please. So next few slides, I'm going to be talking about climate risk mitigation. And I think it's probably fair to say that most of us have regarded the impacts of extreme weather events and has been something that's happened in far-flung parts of the world. But according to the UN, extreme weather has cost over 2 million deaths in the last 50 years and $4 trillion. So that's material to say the least. And for those sports fans, FIFA say that they're going to be needing to spend something like $800 million by 2050 on some of their stadia to make them more climate resilient. Next slide, please. Of course, we've all seen these images earlier in the year, the Californian wildfires in and around LA, absolutely horrific. Most importantly, over 28 people lost their lives, 15,000 structures were destroyed, 40,000 acres of land burnt, and the total cost likely to exceed something like $250 billion. So extreme, but still feels quite a long way from home, doesn't it? But if you then, next slide, please, consider what happened in the Valencia area of Spain, again, just before the LA wildfires, funnily enough, but a completely different event. But again, huge cost. Over 200 people lost their lives, which is the most important figure there. But it's also cost insurance claims over 3.5 billion euros. But in addition to that, then there's been a package provided by the Spanish government to the area of something like 10.6 billion euros. So huge costs, lots of damage to infrastructure, to houses, obviously vehicles, as you can see there, piled up in the streets, huge impacts on people's everyday lives. But the implications are not just felt in and around Valencia or even Spain itself. The ramifications are felt further afield. Insurance companies don't like making losses, and I don't know about you, but I've never heard of an insurance company going bust. So what will happen is they'll look to recover those costs by increasing premiums for everybody. Insurance companies are global companies at the end of the day. So this won't be restricted to Spain or the Iberian Peninsula or mainland Europe. It will be felt worldwide, that's for sure. But the other thing about the Valencia floods, it had other impacts too. Valencia provide or grow most of Spain's, or a fair proportion of Spain's citrus fruits, salads and other vegetables. Spain itself provides 25% of the UK's supply of citrus fruits, salads and vegetables. When things get in short supply, because these areas are being washed away, greenhouses have been completely destroyed, etc. Food prices go up. They go up in the supermarket, in your food shop, and they go up when you go out for a meal at a restaurant. If their foodstuffs have gone up in price, then your bill will also go up too. So the ramifications are felt far and wide. But as you go to the next slide, and even closer to home, now this is very close to my home. I live in Worcester. And for those of you that are cricket fans or sports fans in general, you'll know that New Road, Worcestershire's county cricket ground, is a very iconic ground. It's a beautiful place to go and watch cricket, while away a few hours of that amazing backdrop. However, therein lies the rub, because between the cathedral and the cricket ground lies a river, just where those trees are there. Now, the cricket ground's been there since 1865. They were established in the same year as my football team, Nottingham Forest. Just had to get that one in there. But 18 of the 20 worst floods since these things have been recorded have occurred in the last 20 years. And what that's meant for the cricket club is that these scenes here in the bottom left have been occurring on a regular basis. And that not just means once a year for 18 of the last 20 years, but sometimes multiple times. The season before last, between the end of the season in September and beginning of the following season, April, that happened 9 times. Now you might think, well, okay, if floods, leave it and then only tide it up just before the season. Well, that's not how it works. Grass needs to grow, the ground needs to recover. Obviously, the whole place needs completely cleaning down, etc., and preparing for the season. So what they have to do is they put a tent over the square in the main part of the pitch, and they fill that tent with warm air and carbon dioxide to encourage the grass to grow. But of course, that costs them 30 to 40,000 pounds a time to do that, and they could do that, and the next week it floods again. So it costs the club an awful lot of money to the point now where it's become unsustainable. They only turn over 6.5 million pounds as a business. They're only a relatively small club amongst the county cricket scene. Um, it's become an unsustainable position for them. So they're now having to face the very real prospect of relocating the club away from this very iconic ground. Now, we've talked about loss of life, which is the most important thing. We've talked about the financial cost, but this now then touches on cultural, community, and emotional loss. The attachment to this ground is immense locally and indeed throughout the cricket world. So, if anyone still thinks that extreme weather events and climate change isn't impacting us here in the UK, the evidence is very much there before our eyes. Next slide, please. So why is it important? Because even if the world met its emissions targets today, and as Eleanor already spoke about earlier, we've already exceeded the 1.5 degree temperature rise, and there's nothing to suggest that it's not going to continue to get worse because we're not meeting our targets. And let's say we did. The impacts of the increase in temperature over pre-industrial levels will be felt for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So you need to future-proof your organisation because those impacts are still going to be felt for many, many years to come. You need to future-proof your organisation and become truly more sustainable. You need to meet increased reporting requirements, TCFD, CSRD, to name but two, where risk is very much a focal point. It's critical to your organisation's strategy. It reduces the risk profile of your organisation to your insurers, which we mentioned earlier, and potentially lowers premiums. It also increases your value to investors. Investors like to know that their money is safe. So they need you to understand your risks, and they need you to mitigate those risks. It therefore increases confidence for all stakeholders, employees included, and it will give you a competitive edge, particularly over those competitors that aren't taking actions and don't recognise and mitigate the risks. Next slide, please. So what are the risks to your own organisation? Well, the type and severity of risks will vary in accordance with a number of things, including your organisational size and complexity, the location of your operational sites. In the case of Worcestershire County Cricket Club, sitting right next to a river, and indeed even my football team, Nottingham Forest, is sit on the banks of the River Trent, it's a very obvious physical risk. Your core business activities. So what is it you do? What is it you rely upon to be able to have a successful, thriving business? The location of your key suppliers, because your key suppliers face similar physical risks and threats, then indeed their ability to provide you with the key products, ingredients, materials, etc., will also be under threat. And indeed, what markets your own products and services sold into? Are you be able to get those into market? And what's the applicable time window? So what are you looking at? Strategically, you're looking at a minimum of 5 years, but you could be looking at anything up to 40-year window. And what's the anticipated temperature rise during that time window? And what's the relevant anticipated changes to legislation within that same window? and also the forecast cost of carbon, energy, etc. So there's a lot of variables to be taken into account. Next slide, please. Of course, you can choose to ignore those risks if you like, but it may end up that you become uninsurable. I believe it was the Palisades community in California who were hit by wildfires back in 2018-19. The insurance companies paid out. They didn't like paying out. Those people, that community, became uninsurable. So this time when they got hit by wildfires again, they basically lost everything. They've lost their homes, their cars, their livelihoods, everything. That's not going to be the case in all countries, but it certainly is the case in that particular instance. You'll lose customers. Key suppliers may no longer be able to supply you. Key products and services will become more expensive as they become harder to come by. And operational sites may become unviable. You know, we did a piece of work, some climate impact assessments for one client, and I think it was out of 13 sites, something like 5 of them were at risk of severe flooding within the next 10 years. So knowing that actually really helps them to obviously help mitigate that risk, whether they consider relocating those sites or whatever action they choose to take, but at least they're aware and they're not going to get hit by it in the next 5 to 10 years. It also means that you could end up with redundant assets. And of course, often, large capital projects or bits of plant, etc., are paid for over a period of time of say 10 or 15 years. So if that asset becomes redundant before the end of that capital write down, if you like, you basically lost money and you have a redundant asset. And investors, of course, may not continue to support your business because you'll be seen as too high a risk to invest money into. Next slide, please. So I don't mean to be all doom and gloom. We're just trying to, get your head above the parapet and realize, the risk that climate change is facing all of us. So from an operational site perspective, you can look at site infrastructure improvements. You can improve things like drainage, for instance. But of course, if you do that, you're dependent on the local infrastructure still being intact and people being able to get to site and you be able to get out of site and product to your customers. You can decrease your reliance upon vulnerable suppliers of key products, materials and ingredients. You can invest in the development of products that are less reliant on vulnerable suppliers, whether that's now or in the future. And you can identify more sustainable key products, materials and ingredients. And of course you can, as in that one example I gave a few minutes ago, relocate the site. And within your value chain, there's lots of things that can be done. It's all about obviously engaging your value chain, encourage your key suppliers to identify their own risks and to develop an action plan to help mitigate those identified risks. And you yourself can identify suppliers of alternative key materials or services. You can consider alternative suppliers that have a lower risk profile, and you can consider the negotiation of longer term supply agreements with those lower risk suppliers. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to hand over to Rob.
Thanks, George. Hi, I'm Rob Sunderland, Managing Director of Redlines. If you could go over to the next slide, please. Just tell you what we're going to cover today in my section of the talk. Just give you a little bit of background to Redlines, the business, just to let you know some of the work we've done in this area, so you know that we're well placed to talk on this topic. Just go through a little bit about the sort of introduction to climate risk and climate adaptation. Talk quickly about the different types of climate risk. I think physical climate risks are well understood. Transition and supply chain risks maybe less so. Try and get into the financial impacts of climate change, because I think that's a really important, that's the most important bit for businesses. Go through some real world examples, a few more in addition to the ones we've already seen, just to kind of really reinforce that this is happening now. And then to tell you a little bit about how climate risk assessments can actually help you do something about this. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So Redlines is part of a larger business here, and which has been going for 15 years. The wider business is a weather and climate analytics business, and we work with people like Bloomberg, like National Grid, and we help them understand the weather of here and now. But some of our clients over the years, or maybe more recently, just were really asking us about what about climate change? We've got infrastructure, we've got businesses that are outside and around for a long time. So surely climate change is going to affect us. So we started to help them with that, and really that's how Redlines was born. Redlines is software that helps businesses understand the cost implications of climate change and the transition to net zero. I've put some logos of people we work with there. I've also put in at the bottom IPCC and World Climate Research Programme. This is where we get most of our data from, which drives the tool. So just to be really clear from the outset, we are not kind of climate forecasters ourselves. We're taking the data provided by these kind of world-renowned organizations and making that useful for our clients. If you could go to the next slide, please. So there are kind of two sides to fighting climate change. If you look at the United Nations website, you've obviously got mitigation. So that's on the left. That's understanding your impact, the impact of your business on the environment, and obviously that's all around about getting to net zero and reducing waste and all of the stuff that's probably been covered very well on the website, and JRP do very well. If we can move to the next slide, I just wanted to draw the attention. If we could just skip to the next slide, please. That's it. Yeah, if I just to sort of really focus on the fact that what Redlines can do is help you understand the impact of the environment on your business. So as we go to net zero, there's going to be changes in the weather. There's also going to be changes in the economies of the world and how people do business, and that causes all these kind of external threats onto your business, which can really impact your bottom line. So that's just a focus on what Redlines can do. So move to the next slide. So just to kind of cover that, then there are many ways that climate change and the transition can cost your business money. There are also many ways, opportunities that it throws up as well. But they tend to get split into three main categories. So number one, if we don't make any progress on net zero, and if we don't reduce our carbon footprints, weather is going to continue to change. Net zero by 2050 means that we've got 25 more years of putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So we're going to have 25 more years of changing weather patterns, and it's going to be getting worse than it is now. So things like flooding, heat waves, extreme wind speeds, storms, cold snaps, wildfires, any kind of changes to weather we're going to see. Climate change in general means that the weather gets more intense. So you might have longer periods of drought followed by more periods of heavy rainfall. So changes to the average may be smaller, but changes to the extreme events are going to be very large. The second sort of broad category of risks are the transitional risks. So these are, if we do make progress on CO2 emissions very quickly and we get to net zero, the weather impacts will be lower, but there are much bigger risks to businesses in terms of how that transition to net zero is managed. So you will see big changes to carbon intensive commodities, big changes to energy prices. There will be almost certainly carbon taxes. There are already a number of carbon taxes at the moment, but they will massively increase in certain scenarios. You've got things like reputational risk to your business. All these kind of different kind of categories of risks get bunched under this transitional risk heading. And then finally, a big one is that if physical risks and transitional risks can happen to your business, then they can happen to your suppliers as well, and they can happen to key suppliers in that supply chain. And this can really grind businesses to a halt. Not too many years ago, there was a big range of flooding in Indonesia where all the microchips for cars were made. They were all pretty much the only place they were made in the world, and there was a few factories, but they were all on the same floodplain, and that really had a knock-on effect on new car sales. So these supply chain risks really do, they should be addressed as well. Most businesses, most of their climate-related risks kind of sit in their supply chain. So these are three areas to kind of think about. So move to the next slide, please. So I wanted to sort of now turn the attention on the financial impacts of climate change, because I think it's really important. I think it's really important for because if companies don't know how much it's going to cost them, it's hard to get action. It's harder to drive positive action. So, quantifying these kind of risks in financial terms, gain support. It gives the kind of the context, and it also allows prioritization. So, climate risk assessments can say there is a 20% chance of a flood and a 40% chance of a wildfire. That makes it very difficult for businesses to prioritize those risks. So you don't really know whether one is worse than the other. Whereas if you can say a flood costs us £1,000 a year and a wildfire might cost us £10,000 a year, you have a clear way of prioritizing which one of those risks to tackle first. So that's the background for why we would care about the financial impact. Now, what is the financial impact? So this is some information from a group of central banks called Network for Greening the Financial System. So that's the UK central bank and various other central banks from the sort of the main economies in the world. A very, very trusted source of information, and based on actual data. So this isn't really, this is a forecast, but these guys are sitting at the top of the tree in terms of where the money comes from. So they are seeing real losses. And there's two assessments here. The phase 4 was done in 2023, and the phase 5 was just out this January. So if we can skip to the next slide, just to put an arrow on this graph. If you look down where that arrow is, the phase 5 assessment is basically saying that in 2100, the world GDP is going to be between 30 and 60%, 65% lower than it could have been without climate change. I mean, that is a huge amount. And if you look at phase 4, which was only 2 years ago, the central banks thought that figure was between 5 and about 12 to 15%. So there's two takeaways here. Number one is that just in 2 years, that estimate of losses has gone up an absolutely enormous amount. That kind of scares me. And also the fact that the world economy could be 60% lower than it otherwise would have been is an absolutely huge amount. If we skip to the next slide, I just wanted to make the point that 2100 is a long time away. 75 years, that is definitely beyond the time that I will be kind of doing anything about this. So to try and bring it into context, let's just talk about 2030. So if the other arrow on the graph there focuses you on a much more kind of meaningful timescale, 5 years time. Lots of businesses make 5-year plans. This seems to be a good amount. And that the phase 5 assessment from Network for Greening the Financial System is saying that the damage to the world economy is between 5 and about 12% by 2030. And that's massive. I mean, if you think that every business in the world is going to be between 5 and 12% lower growth than it could have been, this is really important, and this is something that is really meaningful. If you can make sure that your business isn't one of those businesses that's going to be held back by this amount, it's a huge source of competitive advantage. So if you can get your business climate resilient and you're not going to see those losses, this really can turn this topic into kind of a strategic advantage for your company. So if we can skip to the next slide, please. So again, just to kind of really reinforce the message that this is not, we in some senses we have kind of missed the boat. This is happening now. This just backs up all of the information that I've showed on the previous slide, why these estimates are quite drastically being revised downwards, we keep a kind of a running folder of all the news stories we hear, and there's just a selection on the screen here. One of the ones in the bottom left there's a carver maker Freshenet that had to furlough 80% of its workforce this year due to drought in Spain, so very close to home. This is a massive impact on their turnover and bottom line, unfortunately. And obviously, then after that drought, there was terrible floods, as we've discussed. There are I think last Easter, Easter egg prices doubled. It's not the most important thing in the world, but it's an example of it happening. That was due to cocoa yields being much lower than expected as a result of heat waves. So this is affecting every impact of our life right now, and this isn't a kind of like a 10-year away problem now. This is happening now. So businesses that can act and make themselves immune to these kind of problems will really really have an advantage. So if we can skip to the next slide, please. So moving on then, what can you do about this? So climate risk assessments, which is the kind of thing that the Redline software can help you to do. Really, if we look at the end of this kind of journey, what we're aiming for is climate resilience. You're aiming for your business to not be impacted by these costs of floods and wildfires and carbon taxes and all of this kind of stuff. So if you want to get to that point on this journey, the first couple of steps are identifying the risks that your business faces, and then quantifying the financial cost of those risks so you can prioritize which ones to deal with and how. So those two are the kind of the foundations and the key building blocks to find climate resilience. Once you know those things, you know which of those kind of table of risks are going to affect your business and to how much, you can move on to the adaptation planning phase, where you can make plans to deal with those risks in the order of importance, and you can make plans. And it should be worth saying that most adaptation plans are not kind of quick fixes. They do take a while to implement, but they are also almost always much more cost effective to do before there's a problem. So if you can get flood defences into somewhere before it's flooded, it will be much easier and cheaper than to do it after you've started to experience those problems. So the time is of the essence here. And if you can make those adaptation plans, then you can build the climate resilience. So if we can go to the next slide, please. This is just a screenshot of our software. We should stress that we are a kind of a software and data provider, and JRP are a user, an experienced user of the software. And the kind of the idea here is that we provide the data and software, and JRP are well versed in using it to get the most out of it to enable those kind of climate adaptation plans to be put in place. But this is just an example of the output. You can see this business here has got various risks and opportunities associated with climate change. We put a map to show the locations of those businesses' assets and the kind of costs associated with them. So we can go to the next slide, please. I think this is my final one. So just to summarize, climate risk is about the impact of the environment onto your business, so outwards to inwards. There's lots of different categories of risks that can cause cost rises. This is definitely something that is real and an immediate threat that needs to be dealt with sooner rather than later, because it impacts the finances of your business. And then the climate risk assessments, the kind of which can be done by JRP using Redlines, are the first step to that kind of climate resilience end goal that we're aiming for. So I think that's it. I'm happy to kind of take questions later as well. So yeah, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Rob. So hopefully that started to give some ideas on how we can quantify the risks to business rather than just being sort of aware in principle of these sort of amorphous impacts coming at an uncertain future point. And just to add to what Rob's already said about using the tool, we can look at different time points in there to support your business planning, saying, okay, well, what are these financial risks might be at these different points in time, and where are those risks coming from, to start to look at how you can focus your attention to make your adaptation plans. So that's absolutely something that I've been very much finding the tool useful to really start putting some numbers to that, rather than just talking about energy kilowatt hours and how we can reduce those. So it's exciting to be able to access that data modeling. So I'm going to pull this together and start thinking about how you can start to consider this in practice for your business. Hopefully we've established that it's needed, but what do you actually need to do? How can you actually start doing this for your business? So next slide, please. So really this begins with a high-level strategic review to consider where in your business it needs to be considered, and consequently who needs to be involved. I would say at a minimum, it should be including your business continuity, whoever that is, feasibility reviews of CapEx projects, and your long-term product and service development. You need to step back and consider what climate impacts are already being felt, even if you haven't previously thought about them in those terms. So the obvious ones we've already covered a lot of. What are any current or imminent regulatory frameworks that you are subject to, and the cost of levies and preparing reports? So things that might be coming in down the line. So CBAM, if you trade into Europe, that's going to be coming into UK as well. ETS, so emissions trading schemes, other aspects of TCFD, and any other kinds of reporting that has even if you're got internal staff doing that, that's not a zero cost. That's time that they're having to spend doing that they could be doing other things for your business. So what are those costs that you're already feeling relating to climate impacts? Are there any costs or practical impacts relating to seasonal changes or extreme weather? How were you affected by things over the last 10 years, for example, both site repair and alterations or lost days of work from heat waves, staff sickness increases during heat waves as well? So how's that already affecting you? Have you already seen supply chain impacts, such as cost or availability or delays to delivery because of weather and extreme events? And what's happening to your customer demand? Obviously, we know we're in a recession for other reasons as well, but as Rob's already talked about, we're expecting to see that continue. If the strain on your customers' finances continues to increase for all these different reasons, how's that going to affect your demand going forward? What are you already seeing? So this will give you a good starting point for the highest risk areas that are already starting to impact your business. That can give you sort of a sharp focus of where are the things that maybe need more exploration because you don't have a good enough understanding, and how much of these can be put down to climate change. What is it impacting, or what might it increase the impacts of other areas of impact on your business? Next slide, please. So as Rob's already said, these climate risks are typically divided into three broad types: physical risks, transitional risks, and supply chain. So these are considered in your direct operations and in your wider customer and partnership environments. So many of these can also present opportunities if you can make changes that allow you to increase your efficiencies or to access new markets. So the typical transitional risks here relate to how changes to technology are going to impact your direct operations and your market landscape, how changes to policy or legal requirements could impact your operations or your materials that you're allowed to use, or associated additional costs. And then impacts of supply on supply and demand within the markets that you operate in, or markets that might exist in future as a result of climate change, and how are you going to respond to it? If you go on to the next slide. So George has already talked in broad terms about the kinds of risks to site and operations that might be affecting you now or in the future. And it's useful to think about this in terms of timescale, both how rapidly the impact will be felt and how long the impacts will have an effect. So to borrow terminology from healthcare and pain management, I would refer to these as chronic risks, those that endure, and acute risks, those that have a short but potentially devastating effect. So chronic risks for the UK, and this is based on Met Office's predictions, include warmer, wetter winters, hotter, drier summers, and sea level rise impacting coastal and estuary areas. So you need to consider for your business how changes to annual temperature and rainfall profiles will impact your sites, your operations, the infrastructure that you depend upon, road infrastructure, transport infrastructure, electricity infrastructure, and impacts on your workforce. They're so important, and that how do you support your staff to work effectively, and how are these things going to impact their wider lives if they're got children in school and the school is closed due to a heat wave? How does that impact your resilience as a business? What do you need to have in place to be able to support your staff in a, a changing sort of heat landscape, for example? And then for future planning, you might have decisions to make on how building design and other CapEx investments, how that can have a big impact on the cost of your future operations. And then if we go on to the next slide, the acute risks for the UK include more frequent extreme weather, such as storms, summer downpours, as well as the knock-on effects of increased rainfall in the form of localised flooding and periods of waterlogged ground. So you need to reflect on the impacts of the events, say, in the last 10 years or so. How do you need to adapt your business to be able to cope with this? The things that we used to call 1 in 100-year events are happening much more frequently than that. And how do you know how long each part of your operation could be disrupted before it becomes a crisis? How much does each lost day cost you? How much does each lost person hour if you've got reduced workforce? What is the impact on staff well-being of having to do the same, trying to keep up the same amount of output if you've got more staff off? What do you need to put in place so that they can continue to work or to be able to get into work? But also, how do you support them to say, well, actually, this is affecting everybody. We're just going to stop for a day and we'll be in touch tomorrow. And how can you support staff to feel confident that this isn't going to affect their livelihoods? We talked about staff being furloughed. Do you need to communicate with staff about how future planning might affect that? Under what circumstances might they be furloughed? What do you need to have in place for financial resources to be able to balance that productivity and productivity and your workforce in the future? If we go on to the next slide, thinking about supply chain risk. So these same principles, as already been talked about, apply in your supply chain, and you should be having these conversations with your key suppliers, if nobody else, to ensure that they are already considering them. Just-in-time operations, I think that's fairly obvious, are going to carry the highest risk. And I think we're likely to see really big changes in the coming years on how businesses approach stock holding, particularly for key components, to try and manage this risks to supply chains. This headline there came just, I think it was just last week, relating to coffee and chocolate. Further increases expected in food prices. Anyone involved in the food supply chain will know just how much impact there was last year on UK food prices because of flooding in winter 23-24 in the UK farming industry, and how that prevented planting of a lot of crops. So we're seeing that not just overseas impacts of on food supply chains, but in the UK as well. Climate change is also projected to impact water supply and other resources globally. And some have suggested that that our next big sort of civil wars will be around water potentially in the coming years. How is that going to affect political stability in places that your supply chain might depend upon? Though geographical supply chain mapping is another really good way to identify potential risks. Again, the the Redlines software, because it has that geographical mapping, can include that in terms of identifying those key hotspots for different areas. Resources from developing countries have historically been accessed through practices that we should acknowledge have been exploitative. And as these economies change their approaches and have increased autonomy over access to resources, this could have big impacts on the costs associated with some commodities. If you think about what's happening in the EU at the moment with CBAM and increasing expectations of companies declaring what they're doing around climate risk and resilience, if we see those approaches rolled out into the wider world, there will be more and more impacts in your supply chain relating to how you access commodities and how we need to associate the real costs of trying to mitigate climate change to every aspect of the supply chain, rather than at the moment it's not being associated with with what we receive. So we're not really putting anything in place to try and support those mitigation efforts and adaptation efforts. Next slide, please. And then thinking about your customer needs, obviously this will depend on your business type. The impacts of your customers could change a lot. Just thinking there in simple terms, and the reviews of impacts on retail during heat waves have shown closures due to staffing, big changes to purchasing patterns, as well as massively reduced footfall to physical retail, both due to health warnings and people staying at home because they've been told to, and also those people who ignore health warnings and go to the beach instead. So they're choosing their recreational activities over shopping. So there were lots of photographs in the news, the last sort of big heat wave in the UK, of just utter ghost town in all retail areas, as just nobody was there. And then business to business trade is also going to be impacted. We can expect to see streamlining of costs and reductions in anything that's deemed marginal or unnecessary. If your business is dependent on anything that could be considered to be luxuries, how does that fit in a pattern, in a world pattern where people's spare finances, both individually as households and as businesses, is reduced? As I already mentioned, stock holding is likely to change for a lot of industries, so patterns of buying could become much more periodic. That could affect the stability of your production line demand if you're a manufacturer. It could also affect the availability of things if you want to continue to source things in a just-in-time way, but that's not, if your key suppliers are meeting periodic demand from other customers, how's that going to affect you? You need to have those conversations. And then thinking about anything temperature sensitive, many things that we can currently transport as ambient might need to be refrigerated or air cooled or transported outside of peak temperatures at certain times of year, and that all of that will have associated increases to cost. So thinking about what do you do now and how that might be affected will give you, again, these ideas of key hotspots that you need to consider. I go on to my last slide. Sorry, next slide, please. There we go. So just thinking about these key actions. So to develop your climate resilience plan, it's useful to think about it in these three phases. So starting with the short term and sort of more reactive aspects, that they are the easiest to understand, the easiest to quantify, and the easiest to predict. So fairly typically, we're looking at reducing the impact of existing operations. That's all the energy efficiency and things that we've been talking about for years. And we're looking to increase the resilience to both these transitional and physical climate risks to your direct operations. You want to consider future scenarios and how is your business going to be sustainable in that imagined future? And then understand the physical, health and social aspects that are relevant to your workforce and potentially to your customers. Then looking ahead, it's really important to make sure that the responses to climate change that you implement are as low impact as possible, such as designing buildings that stay cool rather than increasing the use of air conditioning. Otherwise, your mitigation adaptation efforts could end up driving up your energy costs, and then that's counter to that reducing the impact of your operations. So next you can move deeper into sort of establishing it within your business, deepening your understanding and looking at future planning and how you're working with your suppliers, with your customers and other stakeholders to be part of the solution and to have a more sort of robust business model in the future. Understanding those wider stakeholder impacts in your value chain, and really getting to grips with the hotspots, but also the data gaps. Where are the big uncertainties? Where do you need to focus getting a better understanding so that you can really quantify the risks to your business? And then looking long term, so this sort of integrate phase, you want to develop a business model that is aligned with the climate change that we're going to see and being a low impact business. So improving your understanding will make you more resilient, as well as more agile to take advantage of emerging threats and opportunities. And the work that you do now will allow you to have a much more accurate and business specific climate risk approach that you can then use both in your strategic planning and then in any reactive decision making to really embed that in your business as just how you work. And because, as we've talked about all the way through this webinar, the risks are real. They're there today, and they're only going to increase in coming years. So building in the knowledge that you need in your business to be able to apply that in your strategic planning is the time to do that so that you're prepared for it and it doesn't catch you off guard. And that will ultimately reduce your costs, as various others of my colleagues have said here. So that's the end of our talking. But I'll hand back to you, George, for the Q&A.
Thank you, Eleanor, and thank you, Rob. Hopefully that's given everyone some good insights, and hopefully answered some of the questions you may have had prior to this webinar. But we do have a number of questions which I'll share between the panelists. I'm not going to answer them all myself. One of the first ones was, how much does this sort of support to quantify risk costs? It's very specific to individual organisations. So we would obviously deal with that on an individual basis to understand more about the scope, the scale, the complexity of your own organisation, and what the key deliverables are that you'd want from that piece of work. So we'll take that up away from this webinar individually, if that's okay. And the same applies to anyone else if you're interested in understanding more about the subject, and how we could work with you to help you to understand the risks, and more importantly, some of your colleagues and senior management team, most definitely, please feel free to reach out to myself or Eleanor anytime post this webinar. There has been a number of other questions. So how can I use climate regulations to build climate resilience? Eleanor, do you want to take that one?
I think it's fair to say that climate regulations really give you kind of a pulse point of how things are changing, but they tend to lag behind good practice. So effectively, early adopters will start to put things in place, and then climate regulation will come in behind them and require a sort of a minimum level. So it really depends what your priorities are. You absolutely should be aiming to meet the regulations ahead of time so that it's not costing you more to try and sort of scramble to be compliant. But anything that you're seeing coming along the lines, or it's really useful to be more ahead of that. Look at what's going on in your wider sort of business landscape in your industry, and look to how close can you be to that leading edge best practice, because that will reduce the risk of when regulations do come in, as well as potentially giving you a competitive advantage.
Okay, thank you, Eleanor. And unfortunately, I think it's one more for you. How do we engage stakeholders and investors in our climate strategy? It's one that we asked many times, aren't we?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the really important thing is to make it collaborative. You need to be having conversations with them about this being a shared journey, because ultimately all of their customers, if they're suppliers of yours, are going to be looking for the same things in the long term. And the suppliers you're already engaged with are the ones you have the most influence over. And rather than moving away from a supplier and saying, "Oh, we're not going to work with you because you're not doing enough," should be an absolute last ditch approach, because it's not just about being seeing to your own business's needs, but it's also about being responsible within the wider supply chain. Because if you just move away from them and they're not changing, but they're going to sell to somebody else, they're going to continue dragging down effectively that bit of the supply chain to the kind of lowest common denominator. Whereas if you can be part of helping them to understand what it is about what they do that needs to change, how these risks that you're already exploring are already affecting them. Another key area that a lot of businesses have, particularly on their sort of social side of theirs, of the ESG, is the commitment to work with small businesses, local businesses. And those businesses particularly can have a much lower impact in terms of their supply chain and their sort of logistics. But they also have much lower resources within their business to be able to do this work. So if you've got a big a big sort of SME part of your supply chain, what could you do to support them with like little tools? Are there aspects of your strategic planning and assessment frameworks that you use in your business that you can share with them in a sort of a light form to really support them to be able to do this for you, rather than putting yourself in a position where, I don't know, your board says, well, all of our suppliers need to meet this minimum standard or we won't work with them. But your SMEs can't meet that because they haven't got the resources to do it. So what do you need to be putting in place now to help them get there at the same pace that you need from them?
Yeah, very good. There was something that I only dawned on me yesterday, Eleanor, in talking to a partner company, and the increased use of AI is massively ramping up energy demand in data centers, but not just energy, but also water for cooling. If you're using a lot more energy, you're also creating a lot more heat in the racks, etc., in the server rooms. So water has to be taken into consideration in the location of data centers as well. I mean, it's not just about, obviously, water stressed areas in the east of England, for instance, affects the food industry and has done for a long time. So water is becoming another area of real focus, irrespective of the sector in which you work. So for me, one of the questions we've got here is, what are the most cost-effective, highest impact ways to improve climate resilience? And I would say planning. I would say look to the future, be aware of the changes that climate change is already having, let alone what it's going to have in the future. And then you can start planning and avoid higher costs, avoid or improve security of supply of key products and services, etc. If you've got anything to add to that, either of you?
Yeah, I would just also just to sort of make the point that we talk a lot about risk and we talk about the costs associated with climate change, because that's probably the most pressing thing that businesses care about in the short term. But if you do this assessment, the climate risk assessment properly, it does uncover opportunities as well. So if you think, we do a lot of work with a really big importer of wine into the UK, and they've done risk assessments on all the vineyards, and the vineyards in the UK actually see major opportunities about growing the conditions for wine growing becoming more favorable. So there are real opportunities around climate change, particularly in renewable energy, putting renewable energy, wind or solar on your property, that can come out of this as well. So it's not a cost-effective point, but doing this sort of planning bit properly can come up with revenue generating points as well. I just wanted to make that point.
Good point. I think we've covered the key questions, but as I said, the question about cost of support is very much specific to the individual organisation, level of support, complexity of that organisation, etc. So by all means, please use the QR code there, and hopefully you'll have seen the poll questions come up, and if you could spend a couple of minutes just completing that poll, it's very helpful. Help us to inform our choice of topics for our future webinars. So just leaves me to thank everyone for attending. Thank Rob and Eleanor for their invaluable input. I'm learning doing these webinars, and I'm supposed to be one of the people that knows more, but they're very, very enlightening from both Rob and Ella. So thank you for your input and thank you for attending. Look forward to seeing you again in the future.